When Jimmy Donaldson, better known as MrBeast, gave up his first-class seat to an elderly woman, no one anticipated the astonishing secret that would unfold at 35,000 feet. What followed left the entire cabin speechless. The sun was just peeking over the horizon at Charlotte Douglas International Airport, casting a warm glow on the fully booked Flight 382 to Seattle. Among the crowd in the boarding lounge, a few eagle-eyed passengers quickly recognized Jimmy, dressed casually in a hoodie and jeans. Despite his global fame, Jimmy appeared as unassuming as ever, glancing at his phone while waiting to board. Seated comfortably in first class, Jimmy flipped through a notebook filled with ideas for his next big project, a giveaway, a charity stunt, or something else that would capture hearts worldwide. Across the aisle, a soft commotion broke his concentration. An elderly woman, Eleanor Hayes, in her late 70s, struggled to lift her carry-on bag into the overhead compartment in the economy section. Her hands trembled slightly, and her frail figure seemed out of place amid the bustling crowd. She was dressed modestly, her cardigan adorned with a brooch that sparkled faintly in the cabin lights. Passengers nearby watched but hesitated to help. Before anyone could move, a flight attendant stepped in, assisting Mrs. Hayes and guiding her to her seat near the middle of the plane. The seat was cramped, sandwiched between two large men who barely noticed her polite attempts to make room. Jimmy watched from his seat, his brows knitting together as the scene unfolded. Then, he made a decision that would change the course of the flight. Pressing the call button, he summoned a flight attendant. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "Would it be possible for me to switch seats with the elderly woman in row 23? The attendant blinked, surprised. "Are you sure, sir? You're in first class." Jimmy nodded with a warm smile. "She deserves it more." As Jimmy gathered his belongings, whispers began to spread among the first-class passengers. A middle-aged man seated across from him, Richard Bellamy, leaned over. "You don't have to do this," Richard said, puzzled. Jimmy shrugged. "I know. But sometimes, it's about doing what feels right." He made his way down the aisle, exchanging polite nods with passengers who recognized him. When he reached Mrs. Hayes, she looked up, startled. "Ma'am, I'd like you to take my seat in first class," Jimmy said, his voice gentle but firm. Mrs. Hayes blinked, taken aback. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly. That's too kind of you." "I insist," Jimmy replied with a reassuring smile. "It's my way of saying thank you for everything you've done." Reluctantly, Mrs. Hayes agreed, and as she made her way to first class, the entire plane seemed to buzz with murmurs of admiration. Jimmy settled into her seat, barely noticing the tight space as he opened his notebook again. But the story was far from over. Once the flight reached cruising altitude, Mrs. Hayes struck up a conversation with Richard, her new seatmate in first class. She spoke softly, her voice tinged with emotion. "That young man," she began, glancing toward the economy section, "reminds me of someone I met years ago." Intrigued, Richard leaned in. "How so?" Mrs. Hayes sighed, her eyes misty. "During the early days of my teaching career, there was a little boy in my class. Bright, kind, always eager to help others. His family didn't have much, but his heart was as big as the world. That boy was Jimmy's grandfather, Albert Donaldson." Richard's eyes widened. "Wait, MrBeast's grandfather?" Mrs. Hayes nodded. "Albert was the reason I stayed in teaching all those years. He showed me how much a single act of kindness could impact a life. And now, decades later, his grandson has reminded me of that lesson." Word of Mrs. Hayes' revelation spread throughout the cabin. Passengers began sharing their own stories of generosity, each tale more heartfelt than the last. A young woman in row 18, Lisa Harper, shared how watching MrBeast's videos had inspired her to start volunteering at a local food bank. Another passenger, James Rivera, recounted how he had been the recipient of a scholarship funded by MrBeast's foundation, which had allowed him to finish college and pursue his dream career. The atmosphere in the cabin transformed into a collective celebration of kindness, sparked by Jimmy's simple gesture. As the plane began its descent, the flight attendant approached Jimmy in economy. "Mrs. Hayes would like to speak with you before we land," she said. Jimmy nodded and made his way to the front of the plane. Mrs. Hayes stood as he approached, tears glistening in her eyes. "You remind me so much of your grandfather," she said, her voice trembling. "He changed my life, and today, you've done the same for me." Jimmy was visibly moved. "Thank you for telling me that," he replied. It means everything to know his legacy lives on. The two embraced as passengers around them clapped softly, many wiping away tears. This heartwarming encounter is a testament to the power of kindness and how a single act can ripple through generations. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring tales. Let's keep spreading the message that even the smallest gesture can make the biggest difference.